welcome to the top 10 most likely unseen issues for the MCS sitting in February 2020 on Trevel Records. Now, essentially the title says it all. We're going to go through each of the topics that we believe are most likely to come up. And the first thing I want to do is just discuss how we've come about this list, because there's a proliferation of lists across all of the internet on whatever topic you want to find, and in studying, essentially it's very critical that those top 10 are as accurate as possible. So again, of course, we are predicting. It's very much based just on the pre-scene. The examiner can throw as many curveballs as they want in terms of the unseen material. However, from what we've got currently, we're going to first and foremost utilize the focus in the pre-scene, depending on how much space is devoted to the issue. And this is a particularly important one because how much time they give it in the pre-scene is indicative of how often, or at least how likely, it is to come up in one variant or more. Also, the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. So there are some key topics that we'll see where the examiner attributes a lot of importance to, just as a baseline exam sort of topic. So for example, we'll get to ethics at some point on this list, spoiler alert, and we will discuss that CIMA want to be seen to be testing ethical content. So overall, it's a mixture of the space devoted to the issue and how important the examiner views the topic to the overall syllabus. Then we talk about the strategic importance as a key basis of each issue, and this is because the SWOT is essentially going to be informing us about how important each issue is, what the most prevalent things are. For example, opportunities and threats are typically going to arise very commonly in the exam variants. So if you've seen the strategic analysis, you have a small window into this top 10 list already, but we will get to them each as they are, of course. So in terms of also the importance likely to be attached by directors. So what does the organization want? If they want XYZ, then typically that's probably going to be quite an important issue. In particular, when we talk about Trevel, branding is quite a big issue, so there might be some topics that are linked to that, of course, and we'll go to see that. And finally, it's based on our experience, not only mine, I've done a lot of these now, but also we as an organization have seen the typical issues, and we know how easy or hard it is to write issues on that subject. And to be perfectly honest, the examiner wants an easy life sometimes. They are human beings as well, so when they write and craft that exam paper, they're typically going to want to have a few of these sort of simpler questions in there that are sort of obvious givens just because of the nature of the syllabus, and that is no different when we talk about the top 10. So that is essentially how we've come to this list. So let's get started on how we prepare for these issues. So the first thing we want to do is prepare key models from the pre-scene information and to remember to adapt them to the new points in unseen material. So that's how we're going to translate what we're given in the unseen and this top 10 issues to our actual exam. So we've got to try and understand these different models that help inform us about how we should respond to certain queries based on what we have in the pre-scene. And then once we get to the exam, we have to then adapt, and that's the difficult part, is adapting from what we know from the pre-scene and what we've managed to come up with in terms of our key models to then pivot to whatever the unseen unknown is in the exam. So that's the tricky part, and that's where all your revision comes in. Secondly, you want to practice mock exams on these kinds of issues, and you'll see that in the Astranti mocks if you are choosing to purchase those, that we're going to heavily focus on what the top 10 issues are and try our best to cover as many as possible. We will throw a few curveballs in there. That's just the nature of us trying to replicate what the examiner will do to you in terms of your exam. So if you get to the mocks and a couple of them don't appear on this list, that's because your exam will be just like that. The top 10, whilst we have an extremely good record of catching usually at least 6 of the top 10 do appear in the variants, but typically we can't predict all the different avenues the examiner can go down, otherwise it wouldn't really be a top 10 anymore. It would just be all of the topics they could possibly discuss, which doesn't help you too much, to be honest. So we have to practice the mock exams, especially on the key issues, but there will be some curveballs in there as well. We should find relevant real-life examples, and that's where the industry pack comes in to help you. We have to prepare some sample paragraphs. That sort of memory of you writing those paragraphs in your studying will allow you to write faster and more effectively when you need to pull an example from your brain based on what you've seen in the unseen. So if a topic comes up about maybe ethics or the compensation split from streaming, you know that there are some examples in terms of Spotify and stuff in the industry examples on the industry pack. So learn those and you'll be very much on your way to success. Of course, learn the typical key points. Advantages and disadvantages is a very common sort of breakdown of any exam question. Typically, acquisitions is the most common. You have the pros and cons to acquiring a certain target and why that might be, and that's when you have to bring in all your knowledge about what's potentially threatening the business and what kind of opportunities are there and what's available in terms of financing, for example. We also need to know and be prepared for which models to use for which issue. It's great to know all the models, but if you apply them wrong, then there's a key issue as well. So we'll do our best here to discuss any models that are particularly relevant. And what I do want to do as a caveat here is that because this is the first sitting of the new syllabus, it's a little bit vague on how heavily models will feature. From our understanding so far, it appears that models will be a little bit less prevalent than the previous syllabus. That doesn't mean you shouldn't learn them. It just means that you don't necessarily need to develop a whole response centered only on a model. They're looking for broad answers and you can use models to support your knowledge, but don't necessarily use them as their own structure for a response. I hope that makes sense and is clear. So with all that discussed, we can actually finally get to our list now. So the first issue I want to discuss is value chain efficiencies, and in particular we're going to be thinking about cost control. We know that the costs for Trevel are very much higher than Spandau. When we benchmark them between the two financial statements, we can definitely see that Spandau are controlling costs far better, whereas Trevel have struggled to in the past 12 months. It could be that they are just acquiring more new talent and that increases costs and usually brings down revenue a little bit because they're relying more on unknown artists and trying to develop them. So there is that potential volatility where the next year will be very strong. But it is important to notice that costs could be definitely brought into a better place. And that's what we have to consider what we can do to do that. Automation is a possibility. When they discussed finding talent, it seemed very, very laborious. So in this case, we definitely wanted, or we would definitely want to sort of consider any option available to make that process a little bit smoother, a little bit less manpower heavy, because otherwise we're going to be spending a lot of money on something that, whilst it is a very fruitful process in terms of generating future income, we definitely don't want to be spending too much on that just from a costs perspective. We want to make that as efficient as possible. And finally, the reason why value chain efficiencies is so common and also something we would be happy to put at issue number 10 is because decision making is part of earning those leadership marks that are fundamental to the overall syllabus in a general sense, and value chain efficiencies and finding automations and sort of cost savings are decisions. So in that case, it becomes a very, very useful issue that is probably going to come up in one or two variants. So what are the likely issues? Well, typically value chain efficiencies is quite straightforward. It's going to be asking, where can we find efficiencies? Where do we get those cost savings from? We can talk about economies of scale, how we can make things a little bit easier. It's not quite as simple in the music industry in regards to it's not very product heavy. It's very much a case of a service industry hybridized with a product industry because there's different aspects to it and very heavily focused on entertainment, which is slightly off key with traditional manufacturing. But with that said, there probably could be some avenues in the unseen material where economies of scale could come about. But by and large, it's conventional wisdom that there is a limited amount of economies of scale in terms of the music industry because it is easy to offer music online regardless of your size. So to some extent, that puts an emphasis on diversification, but we will get to that. But do keep in mind that there might be a case for economies of scale, especially if it's an add-on issue to a new project that's a bit different to what Trevel currently do. Automation is a common one. Typically in manufacturing, that may be just automating some manual processes. In terms of the music industry, it's going to be a little bit less clear, but as I mentioned, it could potentially be AI musicians, as we saw in the industry pack, where we're literally developing music with AI and you don't have to pay AI once you develop it. And also it could just be automating somehow the discovery process of new artists, because that is a very laborious process by the looks of it. And finally, we need to think about our costings analysis to understand whether certain costing methods are appropriate, whether they're leading us to make the right decisions, and whether they are ultimately the best value in terms of generating our form of efficiency, in terms of adding value through our business. So, what kind of key points should we raise in terms of the value chain? Well, how it works and what it is pretty critical, especially if we are literally asked it. Sometimes you can get an exam question where you are expressly asked to develop the idea of a certain model or feature of business. So for example, sometimes they can humor you and give you a senior financial manager asking you, can you remind me about this and how it works and what the implications are for our business and stuff like that. That sometimes they do give you those straightforward ones occasionally, so do keep that in mind, but definitely you have to understand the mechanics of the value chain. So that is essentially how we're trying to add value at each juncture of our operations to make a product that is worthy, as opposed to, it's about building up on top of what the raw materials are. So for example, in the recording label case, if a musician went and just released their music online through Spotify, on YouTube, without any record label, what would it be like? Well, it might lack some promotional materials, it might be not so great at marketing them, there may be some real inefficiencies in terms of generating a buzz around the music, and that's where the record label comes in. So that's our value additions at different stages. So it's very heavily emphasized in the marketing and promotion, of course. And in terms of implications of our decisions, for example, how does automation impact our value chain? Does it help? Does it hinder a different process potentially? Perhaps there is an issue with training and motivation. If we introduce in automation, maybe some redundancies could have a small effect there in regards to the learning curve perhaps. But also the biggest one is the areas of possible efficiencies. So lower cost in talent searching, automated talent searching, which is kind of related, and then maybe lowering advances offered to new artists, because there could be a cost analysis or a strategic question regarding whether, taking off 5% of the advance actually impacts our ability to attract the best new artists. You'd have to compare perhaps with other companies or other rivals and what they offer to brand new artists, and therefore come to a conclusion that perhaps it's best from an efficiency standpoint to offer a slightly lower advance. So, let's now get to issue number 9. This is cybersecurity and blockchain, and immediately it's going to potentially scare you a little bit because it is a brand new topic and it is a little bit scary in terms of exactly understanding it. Many people are going to struggle to fully grasp this, but we have got a very good section on it in our new study text for P2. So don't worry too much, you will be able to access that if you wish, and it's about as simple as you can make this topic. So with that said, let's actually get stuck in as to why. Well, my personal choice of this was partially because it's a new topic, and it's also one of the largest areas where CIMA added to the new syllabus. So to my mind, it feels like they're going to want to ask something new. And in this case, I felt that cybersecurity and blockchain does have some relevance, and there was a few hints that there may be some avenues to work this in. So it really wouldn't surprise me if this comes in one of the variants, and hence why it made issue number 9. So the overall topic is going to center around data threats, the controls, application, physical, business intelligence systems, and in terms of the blockchain, it could be offering security insofar as it's an independent sort of ledger of transactions where it's very hard to hack into anything related to blockchain because of how it works. It has a lot of independent ledgers across loads of different users, so whoever engages with that system will have an independently updating ledger, which will cross-reference all the others in the chain. It's hard to explain in this video, so I won't try to confuse it too much. I am very wary of that, to be honest. But essentially, it offers a level of security to things like ticketing. We saw in the industry examples that there is definitely some cases for blockchain in the ticketing world. It may make it more efficient, may make it safer, it may reduce the ability for denial of service attacks potentially, depending on how it's implemented. So in this case, we do want to have an awareness of how cybersecurity and blockchain can apply to this industry. There's an opportunity to use this as part of other questions as well. For example, a risk management question could utilize cybersecurity and blockchain quite readily, and it would probably fit it more in the sense that it would be quite unfair for CIMA to make a whole question about this topic. Not only is it quite a niche topic and brand new, of course, and quite intimidating, but also it is very much centered on risk. So they're probably going to weave it into an overall risk management question, and you would probably get some really good marks if you can bring in some cybersecurity knowledge. CIMA will want to examine a new topic, is again what I mentioned with the new topic aspect, and it is implied that Trevel utilised some form of online shop for merchandise, and potentially distribution platforms like Spotify could have some issues, but perhaps not Spotify, perhaps more so the ticketing, now that I think about it in hindsight. So with that said, that's why we've chosen it. What are the likely issues then? Well, to my mind, because of how intimidating and difficult this is, I think a lot of this issue will be about explaining and identifying. So my personal number one issue that would arise if it did come up is helping a senior financial manager understand this new form of threat/technology, depending on whether we're discussing cybersecurity or blockchain. So in this case, we'd be identifying the key risk areas appropriate to our IT operations, which may just be our merchandising shop online. And then it would be about methods of protection, the possible threats, and perhaps how blockchain can be used for security if that is referenced. So then we can draw on industry examples like blockchain ticketing, and that may be a basis for which CIMA asks a question, though that would be pretty difficult to answer in the sense that I'm not sure CIMA would quite go for that as a overall topic. Again, I think it's going to be a sub-part, a section of an overall requirement as opposed to a requirement in and of itself. So as I mentioned, most likely an add-on issue to a risk-based question. So what should we talk about? So I've kind of touched on this briefly already. Types of threats, viruses and hacking. Viruses encompass all kinds of things from Trojans to worms. It's not as difficult as it might sound. It really is just about the different types of viruses are all centered around how they're transmitted and how they work. You don't need to know the nitty-gritty of it. You just need to know essentially what some of the key ones do. The big one that they talk about is worms, because it basically goes across networks. And if you think about networks, if you're all working on laptops, which is pretty normal by today's standards, then suddenly you can have an infection that affects the whole business from one vulnerability on one person's laptop. Hacking, again, is another type of threat, which is, as you might expect, people utilizing various methods to gain access to different accounts and causing issues there. We then have to talk about controls. How do we mitigate this threat? How do we, plan for it and make sure it's, as part of maybe a TARA framework style, how do we reduce that threat? And therefore we can talk about physical and application controls as we've detailed in the P2 study text. In terms of blockchain, it's probably going to focus very much on how it works and how it is beneficial. That's, to me, is going to be about as far as CIMA go on blockchain. It would be incredibly unfair, and to my mind, the syllabus doesn't permit anything beyond that. So don't try and work into a very sort of big topic. It's not really going to be that big. It's going to be focused more on how and sort of why. Why would you use blockchain, essentially? Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So of course we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So for example, if the pre-scene is on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really soon, the master classes are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a masterclass on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live. All these kind of aspects. We are very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.